Hello, Changemaker.
Welcome to the Innovation Room.
A place for business leaders,
Change agents and change champions.
anyone who wants to know where digital transformation is taking us,
A place that sparks ideas.
and explores what's really possible with software and technology.
Ready?
Let's see what's happening.
Welcome to the Innovation Room. I'm Kate Fletcher, CEO, mentor, coach and catalyst, and on the Geeks Advisory Board. I'm delighted to be hosting 3 podcasts for International Women's Day as part of the Digital is from Venus series. My guest of today's podcast, Real Models, Not Role Models, has an extensive army leadership career all around the world and led the diversity and inclusion agenda across the armed forces. He has championed the case for diversity and recognises the positive outcomes that gender diversity has on performance, decision-making and culture. Please join me in the Innovation Room with Baz Bennett. I am thrilled to have Baz Bennett with me. Baz has got an incredible career. We'll talk a little bit about it, and I'm going to ask you to focus on one bit in particular. But Baz has an extensive army career, including being commander of the British forces in the South Atlantic. I have my own personal experience of the South Atlantic in a yacht, which wasn't so positive, but I'm sure you've got a huge number of stories around that. Not that we're going to talk about those today. You've also been a CEO and a COO and quite extensive experience. And currently you're Chief Operating Officer at Lord Wandsworth College down in Hampshire.
Correct, yeah.
Today, though, the bit I really want to focus on with you is a critical role that you played a number of years ago, where you were Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Army. And I'd really love to hear a little bit more about that. But as an intro, Baz, would you talk a little bit about that role and the context of that for you in your career?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me, I should say, this morning, most importantly. I'd been the commanding officer of an artillery regiment, as you just touched on. I left that role, having sadly disbanded the regiment, but everyone went on to bigger and better things, I'm delighted to say. And then I found myself in Afghanistan with the US Marine Corps, training the Afghans for a year, and then went to the Army headquarters, and as you say, went into diversity and inclusion. And the role changed dramatically over those 3 years. The role sort of broke into 3 bits. My actual title was Assistant Head Employment Policy. Sounds very grand, but it broke into initially 3 pieces: diversity and inclusion, as you quite rightly said, bullying, harassment and discrimination, and an employment policy. So the sort of nitty gritty, and I think we'll come on to some of that.
We're going to start our conversation today around gender diversity, and we're going to really broaden that through the conversation into the value of diversity of thinking, which is something I'm very passionate about. Our conversation today, I would love us to get into the how, because actually a lot of situations leaders in business find themselves in is the desire to drive the diversity in all senses upwards or increase it. The challenge is inevitably how you do that. And I think you've got some fantastic stories that will help inspire others as to how to approach this.
Yes.
Before we do that, I've got a really important question to ask you.
Okay.
So we're in the Innovation Room. I need to ask you, who would you bring into the Innovation Room with you?
For the people listening, I've only just found this out, so I haven't given it perhaps the due thought it would. I'm going to be very military about it, and I have a huge amount of time for the. I'm going to bring. Can I bring 3 people? But they're all lit. I'm going to bring David Sterling, Jock Lewis, and Paddy Main, who are the 3 creators of the SAS.
Okay.
And so they all play slightly different parts in that. But to me, they are innovators. And if you read, how they go about it, the tenacity they show to actually get the organization formed, and then the early operations it goes on, it is innovation, because no one's ever thought like this. And some of their early successes are down to the fact that the German army in North Africa isn't thinking like that at all. And it is utterly innovative in the way in which they're going about business. No one's ever done this. And so to me, I'd love to have met them all. I'd like to bring them, because I think they were seriously thinking outside the box. I mean, I suppose they had an opportunity because we were in a total war. The UK and the Allies were not in a good place at that stage. and therefore we were trying anything and everything. So the conditions to a certain extent were set in their favour to allow that innovation to take place that perhaps today it would be slightly more challenging. But nonetheless, they still had to be innovative. They came up with the ideas. They actually went and did it for real, and their results are phenomenal.
They are. What a fabulous example. Thank you for that. I think it actually what it demonstrates is just what's involved in innovation as well. We often think, innovation is about, some genius idea over here, which often it is, but actually more often than not, it's about the qualities, the human qualities that exist to speak that out and make it happen.
Yeah, no, and I think their three characters, they always got on with each other, but that doesn't matter. They blended well. They did get on most of the time, but they had a common cause, which was to deliver what we now know and would be very normal as special forces behind enemy lines operations. And the rest is history, isn't it? And they did a phenomenal job.
Right, let's get cracking. So, Baz, talk to me about the case for diversity in the army.
Yeah.
So, as you started this movement.
The case for diversity, to me, there are four headings, and I'll go through each of them. The first segment is the legal case. I mean, the Equality Act 2010 says that we have a series of protected characteristics, which and therefore, as you would expect, the army, like any other organisation, has to adhere to those and does adhere to those. And so that sort of again blended into my whole role as employment policy to making sure that we were doing that well. So the next one I think is the business case, and this is fascinating, which is widening your talent pool. And that is really interesting. The armed forces doesn't have a high enough group of ethnic minorities. Of course, the armed forces would still see women as a minority group within them. They don't see women clearly as a minority group, but within their ranks, they absolutely are. And certainly when I was in that role, Army had about 10% women, to sort of put that into perspective. So it's a very small group. And therefore, it was about widening the talent pool. And the strap line from director personnel at the time, which had been head of HR in a civilian organisation, was maximising talent. That was his strap line. Well, if you're closing off the appeal to all of these groups of people because they see basically straight white men the only people who serve in this organisation, then you've got we've got 50% of the population before you've even started, all the women. You've got a growing number of ethnic minorities. You've got the LGBT community. The list goes on and on and on. Who may feel, well, I'm not really welcome, or I don't really want to be part of this. So trying to widen that appeal, we put a huge amount of work into. So to me, that's the sort of the business case. And it's a reputational thing as well. I mean, that reputation is so important. And of course, you see it in the newspapers all the time. I think, the Army sets itself very, very, and the other two armed services set themselves very high standards. And I think if there is a case of bullying, for example, or something like that, it will have a much wider reach in the newspapers than if it was to happen in a different sort of private sector organisation.
In my role in the work I do, which is around mentoring and coaching CEOs and driving performance in organisations, the things that I find myself talking about a lot and I'm very passionate about are around improving performance and improving decision making.
Yes.
Can we talk about that in the context of diversity and what your
Yes, and can I before I answer that then, I'll link the two because of course they are all linked. The third one is improving operational effectiveness, which I think is where you're starting to take me. And this is the difficult one, of course, because measuring this is now much harder. Those first two are really straightforward. One's just legal. One is, well, of course, you'd want to appeal to the whole eligible cohort who could join. Now we come on to the really tricky one, I think, which is what I would call operational effectiveness. You could call it a whole host of other things, and it is challenging. I think for me, and I'll come back to the Army in a moment, if I may, or the military in a moment, and we used a lot of this as we went through the Women in Ground Close Combat study and other wider pieces. But I think if I start, for me, the really helpful metric that arrived during my time in that role was the McKinsey study on the FTSE 100, where they took gender and ethnic minorities on the top 100 boards in the UK and started to look at their mix and where they sat within that FTSE 100. And it was really interesting. And by this stage, I suppose I've been doing it 18 months. So I wasn't necessarily surprised with the results because I'd sort of got into it and was starting to understand it a lot more. But it was great to have some data that actually showed that if you are more diverse in your decision making, in people who throw ideas onto the table, then actually it will allow you to be a higher performing team. And the top 25 FTSE 100 of that 100 were far more diverse, both in gender and ethnicity, than they were than the bottom 25 were, as an example. Now, there's a really interesting part in there because I think I was very lucky to go to the launch of that study by McKinsey's, and I asked a question and I got the answer I thought I would get, and it's a good answer, and it was to do with how much of that was the diversity of the team and the way you've laid out your results, or how much of it was the willingness of the leader, the CEO in most cases, in those to allow just people, forget diversity now, just people to be comfortable in being themselves. And I think they're inextricably linked, Kate, to be quite honest, because I suspect if you are that type of leader, you're also that type of leader that's going to have less unconscious bias when you go into an interview to hire the next person, etc., etc. And you're looking for those opportunities. But I do genuinely believe that bringing people from different backgrounds will bring different ideas, which will, if harnessed well, and they get the freedom to work within it. You still have to have a structure, otherwise you'll just have organised chaos on your hands. You will actually start to get very good decision making.
Can I go back to a point you made? It was an interesting point of discussion. So the top 25 had far better diversity than the bottom 25 in the FTSE 100. What's your view on that? Why do you think that happened?
Because of people's backgrounds, and it's fascinating when you do sort of diversity inclusion courses within the army, and we would bring in people from ethnic minorities to talk about just their life experiences. They are different. They've been treated differently, and therefore they think differently, and that's a good thing. And you can't just get inside their minds, because it doesn't work like that, because you can only take that so far. You need those people in the room to say, hey, I'm looking at it from a different angle, whatever that may be. And it just makes your organization start to think more agile, more outside the box, to be better than your competitor, whatever that may be that trying to be the highest FTSE 100 company in the UK, or fighting on a battlefield against an enemy. You're trying to outmaneuver each other, to use that military phrase, and therefore having more diverse thought is going to allow that to happen. So it's your experience. And of course, diversity then starts to go much further, doesn't it? You can still have a very diverse organization that could still look, that goes beyond the protected characteristics, is I suppose what I'm trying to say here now is, your social background plays into this hugely, and you will have a different view on how things go. So it is much wider than just the protected characteristics. And but that particular study, yes, they took gender and they measured it. They took ethnic minority, they took and blended it, and then they blended them as well and measured them again. And it was those ones that had the blended highest groups of women and non-white people that performed the highest. But I say, it's not lost on me that you still have to have a leader who gets the value of it. Because if they don't, it'll either just be stifled, and then you're kidding yourself. The room may look diverse, but it's
absolutely no. You're absolutely right, and I go back to my 20 odd years in very big companies, and I know those leaders that really bought into that and what genuinely and authentically believed diversity was good, and those that didn't.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. You get a really different culture as a consequence.
Yes. No, absolutely.
And your point you made about diversity in every sense is so important, because we look at the physical characteristics, don't we? But actually, as humans, we're a product of our experiences. So the broader our experiences, the more value, arguably, we can bring.
And it's a fascinating area. How diverse is diversity. I mean, it just goes on and on. So but I do think you have to harness people's good ideas, and I suppose the challenge is at some point someone has to make a decision. At some point, someone has to stop, and say, right, we need to wrap this up now. We've got the ideas, we've got to put them together. There still has to be a process to deliver whatever it is you're trying to deliver, and that's I guess is the real skill of the leadership, isn't it? To make sure that they've got those ideas, taken them in, giving them the due thought they deserve, discarded the ones that aren't relevant on this occasion or aren't as weighty, and taken the ones that are, but still making everyone feel that they made their contribution. Because, of course, next time it might be a different person whose idea is the right one because of the circumstance you find yourself in. So you don't want people leaving those boardrooms, in that case of the McKinsey study, or maybe an operational headquarters, if it's a military one, thinking, oh, I'm just here sort of make up the numbers and no one ever listens to me, because different circumstances will bring different people's skills to the fore.
A topic very close to my heart: decision making. Can you talk to me about the impacts of diversity in the army on the quality of decisions that were made, if you can make that link?
If I take it down to a tactical level to start with, and I suppose I'm going to slightly move away from the decision making or the decision maker, but certainly when we went through the Women in Ground Close Combat study and looked at particularly the Royal Navy, and Royal Navy do some great work in their ships operations rooms, which, as you can imagine, get pretty hectic at times, but they're very drilled in the way they do business. And there is certainly evidence to more than suggest that the presence of women within those ops rooms brought a calmer feel and sort of atmosphere to the whole ops room, and therefore made the decision making easier, because the tension, even in some pretty intensive situations, doesn't rise so readily. And then, and again, that permeated out into Army headquarters as well, and just areas where different people were brought. So certainly the presence, and I know I'm being very gender specific rather than the whole diversity here, the presence of women definitely brings a calming influence, which in most cases can aid decision making without a shadow of a doubt. I think that's the first thing. I think certainly something that General Carter, who was Chief of the General Staff for the whole time that I did the role that we're talking about, he had served quite extensively with the Americans, and again, and taken some of their ideas, where he had his own Red Team group, which is a group of people that he had brought together who were perhaps slightly more diverse. There was women in there. He had a non-UK officer in there as well, who would challenge his thought-making process when he was Chief of the General Staff, to allow his decision-making to be stretched, challenged, made sure that he was making the right decisions, and they weren't fearful of being, they were cutting through many, many layers of rank that, can, if you don't adopt that sort of attitude, stifle good ideas and innovation from the bottom, because it's quite regimented, and that's designed to stop that happening. And that has permeated down into other parts of the armed forces. Just something as simple as, and again, it came in during that era. We've always had regimental sergeant majors, which a title you'll have heard of, which is the senior soldier in a regiment, but we never had them in our headquarters in a way that we now do. And now all the way up to right up to the Ministry of Defence, there is a sergeant major who sits alongside the most senior officer at that level, so Chief of the General Staff, Chief of the Defence Staff, down into the division and brigade headquarters, who is on the board. And so now we have a soldier who is on the board at all these levels, which we've never had. And again, absolutely vital, because, of course, they're bringing the voice of 90% of the armed forces, and getting that message and that feel into the board members, so they're not, again, sitting there with their rose-tinted glasses and getting first-hand, unvarnished views of what it's like to be in the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, on operation, sailing a ship around the world, whatever it may be, flying a jet, doesn't really matter what it is, and getting that, cutting through that. And it allows for, just gives you tangible evidence that you can take forward, and gives you a much better way of making a decision.
No, but it's diversity of thinking, because it's representative of all of those perspectives, most definitely. Can I take you back to one point in particular, as we're talking about gender diversity in particular here? So I had a conversation with Danny Kerry, who was the Olympic hockey coach who led the women to the gold at Rio, and talking about some of his experiences of the difference between leading really talented elite female athletes versus male athletes. And one of the things he picked up on was and this is quite stereotypical, but the desire of women to talk around the subject more, to really explore all of the aspects of the topic before wanting to make a decision. Whereas he referred to the guys being much more, you tell me what to do and I'll do it, whereas women are like, well, why are we doing this? And help me understand, what are all of the factors that I need to consider? And I just wonder, going back to the chief of staff you were talking about, what conditions did he set, I suppose, to enable that conversation to happen?
I've never sat in one of his red teaming groups because, of course, they were closed for that obvious reason. But I would have imagined, having sat in other ones, that they've been told to have the confidence to challenge everything. Don't be embarrassed. Nothing's off limits. See beyond the rank and understand what the plan or the situation is that you're trying to actually achieve. So it's bringing a relaxed but business-like atmosphere to the scene that I think would get through that. But
giving them that authority to
absolutely. I mean, I suppose the word is empowerment, isn't it?
Yes, it is empowerment.
Yes. And so, but I think he raises an interesting point, and there is, when we went through the Women in Ground Close Combat study, we were it was really interesting to look at the propensity of women who wanted to join the army at all, and certainly would be interested in going into what is the more physical end of the organisation, and so we were quite struck by these individuals because there was no doubt they were more determined than their. I'm very careful what I say now. There'll be lots of people who are listening to this who go, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about." But I'm talking average with average, and it's really important that when I stress what I'm talking about, I'm measuring average with average. Yes. But it's because women's physiques and physiological are less strong average, less strong explosive power, and et cetera, et cetera. They have to be more determined to reach the basic standard of the part of the armed forces that they were going to join, and this, of course, was a very physical part of the armed forces. So there is a definite determination there that if you were measuring just average with average, that you would see a higher level of determination. Of course, that doesn't stop at going to the gym and running fast. That then permeates into everything you do. And I think it's less about. I think when I was a younger officer, you and there were less women around, and oh yeah, she would just try harder, wouldn't she? Because she's a woman, she thinks she's got to prove herself. I don't agree with that statement. No. I think they did try harder because they had the propensity to want to excel. They were a small cohort, but their desire to do well, average on average, I would argue, is higher than the 90% men average that you're measuring against. And I'm not having a downer on men at all. And I think there are some incredibly talented men in the armed forces, hundreds of them, thousands of them. But if you measure average with average, which is what the study was all about, yes. There is definitely something about just the fact that you're joining a minority group into an organisation that is currently still very male-dominated, but also very physical. And as I've already said, a woman's body has to go through greater and harder training for that body to achieve the same as an average man would have to do because of just makeup, physique, and all the rest of it. So, but it's not just about physical. It then blends into the mental.
So having role models, I think, is so crucially important, whichever environment you're in. And I was in a FTSE 100 business a number of years ago and really struggled to find any female role models at all at the top level. I mean, things have changed quite dramatically in the last 15 years since that time. But I imagine being in the armed forces, that also having been a real challenge. So,
yes,
can you talk a little bit more about progress and how that's helping?
Absolutely. I mean, I think role models are really, really important. I heard a phrase, and forgive me, I cannot remember who said it. I think I was in an LGBT conference once, but I heard a lady saying, I've never forgotten it. She said, in many ways, there is something more important than the role model, and that's a real model. Yes. And I think it's a great phrase. And what she meant by that was, we could look at General Sharon Nesmith, who I've already talked about, a 3-star general. Deputy Chief of the General Staff. She's a role model, but she most probably isn't a real model to all the women in the armed forces because she's so senior, so successful, that people will go, well, I couldn't get there, and therefore they start to, they can't get the connection perhaps. I mean, she's a fantastic person, has a phenomenal personality, and she can connect with anyone, but you know what I mean if you've never met her and you see her at a distance. So you need role models or real models right the way through the rank structure.
All the way through, don't you? All the way through the hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's absolutely vital. I suppose for the Army, we majored significantly on networks. We completely reinvigorated the Army Service Women's Network. And it has, and that has paid huge dividends in terms of not just being a network with a voice that people, again, like the Chief of the General Staff, would attend their conferences, listen to, and all the rest of it, and they have significant senior champions, male and female, but also the fact that you could go to the individuals on the committee or others and point individuals who are having problems or whatever it is with getting this moving forward. So I think that's the first part, starting. The Army or the Defence now does a mentoring service for women in defence, and it goes wider than just, it was one of the last things I did before I left actually, it goes wider than just the 3 uniform services. So my mentee was actually a defence contractor, a young lady who was just starting out but was still in defence, and trying to get them access to people who needed that. And so people used to say to me when I would talk about the networks, and there are quite a few of them, people would say, well, where's the men's network? And I would say, well, you're more than welcome to have a men's network. There's no reason why we can't. It's a voluntary thing. It needs to be set up by volunteers. We can give you a bit of funding from my organisation, but fundamentally to do it. And I would pause and I would say, but of course there is a men's network, even though there isn't officially. It's called the British Army and it's alive and well. And it would go, because it's all the things you don't realise, the mentorship, the sort of career management, the things that people that would give you, and you sort of start to follow that. Again, women either felt they didn't have the confidence to go forward and ask those questions, or just didn't want to. So I think that part of it has come on significantly and will continue to do so. We did a lot around when we launched Women in Ground Close Combat, and the first 4 regiments of the Royal Armoured Corps were chosen to be the first 4 to take women into those cap badges. With the commander of the Field Army, we did a lot of work around which regiments they were going to be, and making sure that they were in garrisons that had other regiments that had a lot of women in them already, like logistic regiments, for instance, so that there were mentors and not just on hand for the women who were going to join at these most junior ranks, but actually for the chain of command, so that the commanding officer, who was a man, clearly, because only men could be in those regiments, most probably spent 20, 25 years in the army at this stage in an organisation that would have had a few women in it, but they would have been in the attached ranks, so sort of clerical roles, catering. Maybe he would have come across some in sort of combat support, in sort of artillery and engineering, but only when he was on operations or on exercise. In barracks, they wouldn't be there. And so we tried to make sure that we gave them a bit of a wraparound, so everyone had mentors, rather than just the women themselves who were going to come into these, because of course it was a cultural shift, and we needed to make sure that we were setting the conditions correctly. And so, I think the whole area is a really important area. It's men have a huge part to play in this, because particularly an organisation like the Army, where the percentage is still so high, and will remain high, I suspect, forever, more to do with physiology than anything else.
Those my experience of networks has been, in corporate life, I was the most senior woman often in the business. And so then was the sort of face of a network, but found it quite difficult to make these effective. And as I reflect on it, actually, I think much of the reason for that was they weren't bought into more widely in leadership. It was sort of seen as, oh, well, you can go and do that for the women, rather than as an organisation, believe in this and taking this really seriously. And I'm interested, because when you're in a minority and you're in a network, it's a bit like girls for the girls, but what it doesn't really mean anything unless it's really heard and
Yes, so I suppose, when I arrived in that role, the LGBT network was thriving and was still
yes,
thriving when I left, actually.
yes,
And so we sort of took that as best practice, and the way to do business. And it had a voice
yes,
across the armed forces. It was listened to by senior leadership, but it also had dedicated people who were willing to give it their time. And of course, one of the things the armed forces would allow is people to have time off to go to conferences, to meet in these meetings. They would be able to claim their travel and subsistence for that. So it was trying to open the door to make this not an actual strand of your job specification, but certainly something that was being actively encouraged. And what it would do is absolutely be mentioned in your appraisal as a positive thing.
yes,
So if you were sort of in the committee and playing a significant part, and so I suppose where I saw it play out best was certainly when somebody would come forward and want to transition, mostly in the case of the army, male to female, to have that first-hand experience of somebody else who'd done it was extraordinary.
yes,
And I also saw it work the other way as well, which was brilliant for the chain of command, where someone had transitioned, were perhaps not behaving as well as they should do, and sort of hiding behind their transition. And we were
yes,
able to bring in more senior people who had also who were transgender to basically say, look, that's not how you behave. You're still in the army. These are still the rules. And so it worked both ways beautifully in a very complex emotive area that most people don't understand and get very nervous about, because they don't want to get it wrong and don't want to let these people down, but they then sometimes overcompensate, as you'll be fully aware, as you get into sort of more the minority parts of people don't like it. And but I think the networks did work. I mean, they can only go so far. I absolutely would be the first one to hold up my hand and say the reason why there's still a bullying, harassment and discrimination helpline within the armed forces is because we're not there yet, and there are areas that are, we haven't sort of talked about that so much, but there are areas that are still not where they need to be. But in terms of doing what it can as a corporate organisation, I think it's trying to, and it's doing it at the top, in the middle, and trying to encourage that at the bottom. There will always be people, won't there, go, well, this isn't working, it didn't help me.
yeah, of
But I
course.
do think it's within its resources, it's doing it's pretty good
Yeah.
job.
Okay, well, I love that phrase, real model, not role model. So
Yes,
I might be using that again.
yes.
A topic very close to my heart is what we've talked about as being the group in the middle. So this sort of pool of
Yes,
key talent. So late 20s, typically
yeah,
through to early 40s, female who
yes,
want a family and want a career, and often find themselves, as I did in a corporate life actually, making the choice to get off the corporate bus, because I didn't feel it had the environment that was the right environment for me to thrive
yes,
in a very senior job and also be a mother. um,
yes, yeah, yeah.
so I'm keen, that challenge of juggling parenting, having a career. How's the army and the armed forces?
Everything you've just said, Kate, is bang on, and it was very easy to look at the data of women leaving the armed forces, and it's exactly as you described. It's when you described, and it's for the reasons you've described. A large proportion of women in the army who have a family are married or with a partner who is also in the armed forces. Of
Yes.
course, it just doubles the moving around, going away for long periods of time. Yeah, makes it even harder. So yes, we were looking at this group in quite a lot of, because we knew we were just hemorrhaging talents that we didn't want to. So we did a trial which has now sort of gained some legs. There was a lot of work, and there still is a lot of work. Some of it was outside of my team, but that employment policy played a huge part in it, about just making the army more flexible. And I think it has been, and I'll come back to that in a moment if I may. But certainly my trial was called Flexible. Was it called Flexible Duties? I think it was, but it was part-time working. And so we started a trial to say, right, we're going to offer you two layers of part-time working. The first one bizarrely wasn't part-time working at all. What it did was we said, for a period of time, we are going to, unless World War III starts, we're going to allow you to be non-deployable. We're going to, you'll still work 7 days a week or 5 days a week or whatever it is in the job you're doing, but you just won't be deployed.
You know where you'll be.
Yeah. So you can have a chat with your line manager about timings and all the rest of it, but fundamentally you're going to sleep in your own bed every night, and so that builds you some certainty in terms of childcare and all the rest of it. And then the second group was genuinely part-time working, so they also had that layer of certainty that they wouldn't be deployed. But then we started talking about, well, okay, then most people, if they're in a headquarters role, would work Monday to Friday. Let's talk about cutting that to 3 days a week. And again, that could be carved up in a number of ways. And it had, it certainly, again, I'm afraid I can't tell you where that's got to because I'm 2 years out of date. My apologies for that. But it had got momentum. There were certain areas, interesting in the medical fraternity in particular, who really jumped on board with it. And it was going great guns. And they were absolutely, having sat on the board that decided whether you should or shouldn't be taken onto the trial. And we ran sort of 4 or 5 boards over my time in that period. When you read through them, you thought, these people will leave. This is their only chance of staying in the armed forces. So I'm delighted that we did that, and it was successful, and it would have kept people in who are utterly talented, who then can come back to either full-time working or something different in the future, and take it forward from there. What I am delighted about, though, is one of my last roles before I left was to work in Director Joint Warfare, which is in the Strategic Command up in London in Northwood. Having been overseas for a few years and coming back into there, was just seeing the number of different contracts the armed forces now offer, which does bring more flexibility. So something called full-time reserve service, and that can break into home commitment and overseas commitment, and you can tell by the name that home commitment, you're still looking like a soldier, sailor, airman, or woman, but you're not going to be deployed. Something called VER, which stands for Versatile Engagement Regular Reserve, which is literally a 0 hours contract for ex-regulars. Again, non-deployable in most cases, maybe 3 days a week or something like that. So it has more than woken up and understood that there is some significant talent that in its very traditional 7 days a week, let's all go to Afghanistan or wherever the operations are, and it's going to cycle through, that just doesn't work for people in the way in which you described earlier on. It has allowed people to stay in. And you're absolutely right. Whilst it is, I've used the word people throughout everything I've said for the last 2 or 3 minutes on this subject, we aimed it at women, and I don't mind saying that because, of course, it's open to everyone. But, for whatever reason, and it doesn't seem to be changing in the near term, does it? The UK society, Western society, by and large, still sees a woman taking a greater part of childcare than the male counterpart, and that hasn't changed. So yes, the reason we championed it as a department was because we were keen in keeping more women in the armed forces, because we could see this great talent, hemorrhaging, and so we were hugely up for doing that. And even just little things. I mean, of course, this is pre-COVID. I remember Chief of the General Staff saying, I'll give you more laptops to work at home because I know you'll work hard. I've talked to the Army Service Women's Network. He said, I know how diligent you are because, women are diligent and they will get it done. And so, yes, it was a good success story at the time when we did it.
Having, being a parent, but having, become a parent 12, 13 years ago, my experience was that parenting has made me a far better leader as a consequence. I've written about this quite a lot, and I talk to other people about it. But I'm interested. So I guess it's probably more your own personal point of view on that, and what you noticed, and have you seen any attitudinal change within the armed forces around that point?
Yes, I mean it's a really good point, because actually I was talking. Fun enough, I was sitting next to a female officer on Saturday night, actually, who's XO of an artillery regiment, and we were talking about she left the army and has come back and was saying that she's a much better person for it. She's also a mother as well, as a mother as well now, and I absolutely buy that. I think it changes your outlook. Again, it makes you more diverse, to go right back to where we started this, because you've had other experiences, and of course, yes, you've got your parenting as well, where I think we struggled, and I don't have a solution for you, but I reassure you, we were talking about it a lot. Is how do you when someone leaves at the moment when they come back into the army, they clip back into where they left. Now they get the years added back on the other end, so they can still do a full career. But the problem you have is that their peer group have moved on, and how do you clip them back in? And that's something again that's being looked at the moment. That certainly wasn't done in my time. Looking at lateral entry, accelerated, and all the rest of it. And but it's how much you can measure the tangible experience let's call them their male counterparts, but it doesn't have to be their counterparts, have had, say, doing 3 or 4 tours of Afghanistan in that period, which of course is very important, is going to make them better military officers or soldiers because of that combat experience, versus someone who's got a very different experience, parenting, working in the city, whatever it may be, and they can bring that back in. And I think a study called Project Castle, which the Army is doing at the moment, which is sort of throwing a lot of the preconditioned terms and conditions up in the air and going, look, we're in a very different world now. We need a lot of different talent. We need people who perhaps can't meet the physical standards, but they've got such a talent in a cyber area.
Yes.
We need them. Then how do we career manage this eclectic mix of people rather than the very regimented, you get promoted, you get paid more, etc., etc. So it's an area that I know is complex because of the terms and
Very
conditions
complex,
and
isn't it?
political acts that make up the terms and conditions of the armed forces. But I can assure you, the desire to have that conversation and try and maximise talent, going back to that strap line, and take those experiences that people who may have been in the armed forces already or wanted to come to it late, making more of the reserve, Kate. I mean, the reserve has a huge, because of course the reserve has the armed forces is their second career, not their primary career in most cases, and therefore their skills they bring are phenomenal. And I certainly found I took about 20 reserves to Iraq when I was a battery commander, and they were most probably 5-6 years older rank on rank for my regular soldiers, and therefore just that alone brought experience. But they ranged from plumbers to bankers to everything, and then their skill sets, but just their outlook actually. Sometimes it was their actual skill sets; they could fix something that none of us could fix, and sort of do it in house. But actually, most of the time, just a wider, diverse look that made the organisation. So they made up 20% of my battery for that operational tour. It only made it a better place to be because they just brought this different outlook on life and sort of clipped in. So I think it will only grow, this area, as the armed forces realises the talent it's had. And also, going right back to your actual question, costs a huge amount of money to train someone to be a soldier or an officer or an airman, woman, sailor, etc. And why would you want to lose that core leadership skill that you invested in so heavily? And then if it needs to go away for a few years or slow down for a few years, then absolutely that's the way to do it. And so yes, they're working it hard. We started it. Other people as well. I certainly can't take hardly any of the credit for it. Lots of people work in this area because it's so important, and you need to hold on to the talent. And
actually leans into another really big societal challenge, I would say, and one that's getting quite a lot of focus at the moment around gender pay gap. If you go back to the point about, okay, I took 2 years out to have my children, I brought them up, I ran the home, CEO of the home, etc., etc. Actually, the abilities and the capabilities that you develop when you're running a home, bringing 2 children up, and running a business of sorts, far greater asset actually to people. And how
you're much more, I think, much more deadline driven. Things have to be done on certain times. You're very focused. I agree with you.
At the moment, the system isn't valuing that, and that for me, that's part of the challenge around gender pay gap. People step out, stuck in, and almost where they left off, not valuing those couple of years or however long it is that they've been out of the system for. Where this is leading us, Baz, which is a really interesting topic, I think, is around the more diverse people, the more diversity of thought there exists, actually calls for far more leadership capability to be able to unlock that, to lead it, to motivate it, to leverage the potential of that breadth that you now have in place.
Absolutely.
What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose that brings in what we didn't do was talk about the fourth case for diversity, which
Okay.
nicely wraps me out into that, which is the word is absolutely, because the last one is the moral case, which is to stand there and just say it's the right thing to do. So, who wouldn't want to be part of an organisation that has that attitude? So, I think if I sort of start from that point of view, to me, without a shadow of a doubt, that is absolutely what we should be doing. And I think it goes back in some of the other bits we were talking about. You will harness that talent not only in its someone who's got a different experience to somebody else, but also bring them in. If we go back to sort of part-time working or whatever it may be, the willingness then of that person to play a full part is greater. They feel more comfortable. They start to be more themselves, which then gets out the very things that you want from them that perhaps are being stifled. What you don't want is everyone acting and behaving the same, which you might find quite odd coming from someone who spent all their time in the army, because of course that's a very stereotypical view, but that's the last thing you want.
Yeah.
You want people who think differently, and they're going to think differently because of their experiences.
What does that demand from leaders then to really unlock that potential?
I think it's high EQ. I really do, and empathy to really understand it. And of course, the army has that really difficult challenge, doesn't it? Of we could be sitting in a situation like this. I could be doing a career interview. It could have this sort of tone. I could be using this sort of language. I could be absolutely taking the sentiment that I've discussed with you over the last hour or so, versus those then same people could be in a very difficult situation, putting themselves in harm's way, where orders, and I use that word on purpose, have to be given and have to be followed. Otherwise, the job won't get done. So I think it's dexterity of mind, knowing when to dial up the EQ, when to dial up the more orders fashioned way of doing business,
Yes.
and when to switch between the two. It's not an easy thing to do. That's a very talented. It's a very talented thing to be able to do. Some people are far better at it than the others, and I suppose it's understanding and knowing the environment you've walked into, isn't it? I mean, that's the situation,
Yes.
and reading the room, so to speak, even if it's not a room.
Absolutely. And that,
And
that sort of ability to be kind of ambidextrous in
yeah,
your approach to
yeah,
leadership. So
yes, yes, and I've seen it done wonderfully by people, and that sort of air of authority, but still with kindness, I think. And so people are feeling comfortable, but also feeling led at the same time. I think people still want both. They want kind leaders who listen to them, who are interested in their lives, interested in their families' lives, what's going on with them. But at the same time, they still want to be led. They don't just want to have someone who's just a great person who they can chat with over a coffee, but won't actually lead them. I mean, the organisation, whatever it is, still needs a leadership with a direction, with a vision that allows it to move forward. Because and I think the blend is, of course, your perfect leader and successful organisation.
again, the line you gave me about half an hour ago, the sort of real models, not
Yes,
role models line.
yes,
I'm really interested looking back into the armed forces. You don't need to give any names necessarily, but if you can give some examples of some of those real models who would have been really inspiring figures for you, what were the qualities that made them particularly inspiring?
so their integrity, I think, without a shadow of a doubt. I think if I'm being honest, through trust.
Yes.
And therefore trusting them to follow through on whatever it is they've said, or
Okay.
trusting them that if they said we need to do this, that you knew it was the right thing to do.
Yes.
And I think that's the first thing. I think the second area I'd use was inspiring. I just loved the fact that they were enthusiastic about what they were doing, and therefore it made me enthusiastic about what I was doing. I think that was important. And so, yeah, I think they're both important. Having respect for others, and bringing the whole team together, and not feeling that they were somebody that just told people what to do and they were told to get on with it. So listening to other ideas, and therefore to me they became your real models of people that you look up to. And I'm still in touch with a lot of them today, who I would still ask advice from, because I trust and say what they have to say. They know how I tick, and yeah, they're really important people to me.
Before we go, people who are listening to this may be
Yes.
running a business, they may be in a business, passionate about this topic. What would be your advice from your experience? So if the listeners are wanting to really make a tangible difference in the diversity and inclusion
Yes.
agenda and really meaningfully move it forward, what would be your advice?
Get involved. I'm very lucky because I work at Lord Wandsworth College. It takes it extremely seriously on many, many levels, and we invest time, effort, and money into it. And our deputy head, Alex Patterson, spends a huge amount of time championing it for everybody, and I do mean everybody. So the pupils, the parents themselves, we have diversity inclusion seminars for them, and of course the staff. And so I think first thing, as I say, would be get involved. Would be the first one. I think have a very open culture is the second one. A culture where you feel comfortable to come forward and challenge any of the notions or just kick them around, but certainly where you feel something is going wrong, and what I call the climate. And then having you should be comfortable as an organisation if your culture is in a good place, that your complaints, if you like, about whatever they may be, behaviour of other people, whatever, should increase before they decrease, because you're comfortable now that your people, your pupils in my case here, or our staff, feel comfortable that there aren't going to be ramifications on them, or it's going to be buried and no one will listen if you've got that sort of culture. So to me, it's get involved, set the culture, and then start going about some of the tangible changes would be the sort of 3 steps. And it will never stop, Kate. I mean, it will never stop. I know it should. I mean, I used to say when I did that job, ultimate success of this role is it should disappear for obvious reasons. I suspect it won't, and that's not a defeatist attitude at all, nor any reflection on my team, the teams that have gone in that job that continue since we left it. But nonetheless, it's a lot of work to do to get to that sort of, I suppose, panacea that I'm describing. And there's still a lot of unconscious bias and out there that we need to continue to work on to set the conditions, because ultimately all of this stuff just allows, what you want is a person to feel utterly comfortable to be their best in any situation, and they can only do that if they feel they are safe and secure, and they can say what they say without any ramification. No, it's not rude or offending anyone else. And then you have your FTSE top 25 humming along as you want them to, in my opinion. I see that through a military sphere, really, but or being here in the school, that is the way you get it working. And so I used to, when I first started doing my presentation for the Army, and I was very lucky to do it to some pretty esteemed groups, and it gained over that period, as I described right at the beginning, it got bigger and bigger. And when I started it, the title of the presentation was diversity and inclusion. Then I changed it to inclusive leadership. Yes. Then I changed it to good leadership. And by the time I finished the job, I called it leadership.
Yes. Well, thank you, Baz. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for your time. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us in the Innovation Room.
We hope it sparks some ideas.
Want to learn more about what we do?
Maybe you could even be our next guest.
And spark some ideas yourself.
Find us at Geeks Limited.
And join us again soon.
Because real change never stops.